So we are now being recorded. My name is David Kramer. I am the director of the library at the Jewish Theological Seminary, and it is our pleasure to offer this series of book talks each year dedicated to important books in Jewish studies. That includes both books by authors out in the world and, with special affection from our side, books by colleagues at the Jewish Theological Seminary. And it gives me great pleasure, therefore, for us to be sponsoring this evening a book talk by Barbara Mann, a friend and colleague at JTS, and to give her the opportunity, and you the opportunity to hear, her the opportunity to speak about, but you the opportunity to hear what she has to say about this marvelous, marvelous book. I will just say in the background that speaking in my capacity as librarian, I often find myself in the position of giving what we call rare book room tours. And there's a lot to be learned from books in their many, many different qualities. People expect us to focus on the content of books, by which they usually mean the text. But the truth is that as I make these presentations, I emphasize the materiality of these books. They are crucial survivors, records, objects that preserve all kinds of personal memories and history, community memories and history. There's just so much that is contained not in the words of a book as such, but in the way a book is created, the way it's decorated, the way it's put together, the material that's used, and so forth. And so when I heard, Barbara, about your publishing this book and the title, The Object of Jewish Literature, A Material History, I said, I can't wait to get my hands on that book, because it is so obviously crucial to everything that we do in the great JTS library. So for those of you who are here, that is what we are about to hear. I just want to emphasize, please keep yourself on mute. But if you stray off of it, you will know that I've got the list up right next to me on the screen. And if somebody needs to be muted, I promise I will exercise a quick and heavy hand in remuting you. There will be time for questions after Professor Mann's presentation. You're welcome to throw those into the chat whenever you like, either during the presentation or at the end, and I will gather them and convey them to Barbara after she's finished with her presentation. So Barbara, the screen and the microphone are yours. Please go right ahead.
Thank you so much. So first of all, I want to thank you, David, for inviting me to speak this evening. It's a special honor because the book, as you will see, my book, I was fortunate enough to, to have the JTS library and its treasures, its old space, and this sort of the access to certain kinds of texts, which were just really formative for me. And I'll talk a little bit about that when I get to those books in the text. So I'm going to share my screen. Let's see how this. Wait, hold on just a minute. Make sure I'm doing the right thing.
Find the right screen, huh?
I got to find the right screen.
There it is. You got it.
Okay, so I'm hoping that you guys can see me as well as the screen.
Yeah,
correct?
We can indeed. We
You
can.
can. Okay, and how's the sound, David? The sound's okay? I don't need to do
Sounds
anything.
great. Yeah, go right ahead.
So I am a scholar of modern Hebrew literature and Jewish cultural studies. And in my work, which I guess you could call interdisciplinary, but I've always been interested in the connection between culture and stuff, culture and space, culture and memory, and culture and things. And so I am trained as a literary scholar, and that is really what I love to teach day in, day out. But I've always had a kind of when I was in graduate school, I used to call it discipline envy. I always wanted to know what the art historians were doing, or what the sociologists were doing, or what the anthropologists were doing. And so I think in my scholarship, that's kind of played out for me in really productive ways. So my first book was a cultural history of Tel Aviv. So kind of a history of space, really, and architecture and photographs and painting and literature. And then in my second book, I looked at kind of a key term of space and place, and kind of traced that through Jewish history, from the Tanakh to the Palmach, as we say, like from antiquity into modernity. And then in this book, I would say the origins of this book, and this is the book, The Object of Jewish Literature and Material History. I wanted to put this slide up right away because I'm going to come back to the marvelous image on the cover. And I'm grateful to YIVO and the Center for Jewish History downtown for allowing me, to put this image on the cover. This is the cover of a Yiddish little magazine called Eigens. Eigens means one's own. And you can see, the red, this is the red title in red. And then the background is this delicious, really amazing, to my mind, kind of mesmerizing, Art Deco version of a fox chasing its tail and then getting chased by another fox. And we'll talk a little bit more about this image, this magazine in particular. But it was meaningful for me to have this on the cover because I think it's such a striking and important image, and also the relationship to Kiev, right? In other words, so this is a journal, a Yiddish language journal that was produced in a city that at the time was really one of the centers of modern Jewish cultural expression. And so 100 years later, I was very happy to have it on the cover of my book. Of course, I chose it before any of what has happened in the last 6 months happened. So it has even more meaning for me and even more resonance for me now. So I want to tell you how the book came about. So if you are a scholar in the humanities, as I am, you spend kind of a lot of time with stuff that looks like this, with little pieces of paper, some of which have, handwriting on them. Some of them are notes. This is, from someone's personal diary. And you just kind of get sensitized, or, my book really begins in the archives with objects like this, with little snips of paper. And many of these things are, many of these papers are pre-war materials that were moved either to the United States or to Israel. Some of them are still in Europe, but a lot of the material that I looked at had been moved from Europe to either Israel or the United States. And everything that I kind of encountered in archives was crumbling in some fashion. So again, this is also from YIVO, and I'll talk a little bit more about these particular journals later. But you can see, again, covers of Yiddish little magazines on the right, Chaliastra, published in Warsaw in 1922, on the left, Ringen, published in Warsaw in 1921. And the experience of working in the archives with this kind of material, with paper, particularly with crumbling, fragile paper, and touching it and handling it, really, kind of sensitized me to the idea of the book as a physical object, and even as a kind of an endangered object, as something that was potentially fragile or vulnerable. And I wondered if there was at all an awareness of this possibility of the book's end, if you will, of its fragility, of its vulnerability, in the work itself, in these little journals, in the novels. Can we somehow point to a kind of an awareness of it in the content of these items that I was looking at? You'll see where I'm going in a minute with this. Now, I want to say from the get-go, even before we get to the modern material, which is really at the heart of what I'm interested in, that a kind of a connection between something that we might call the materiality of the text and something that we might call sacredness is, it's a long-standing feature of Jewish text, going right back to, this idea of scrolls or certain, sorts of written documents. If they contain the name of God, then they have to be handled in a kind of a special way. You know, there's a whole series of rituals that have developed over time within Jewish tradition about handling certain kinds of texts, about touching certain kinds of texts in certain ways, because they're considered sacred. And I wondered, and this is really kind of the big question that I try to address in my book. This was sort of the question that I was interested in exploring, is sort of what happens to that reverence for the sacred in modernity, in texts that are secular in nature, right? Where does the reverence go? Where does the sort of the respect for the book as a material object, as a potentially sacred object, where does that go in the sacred, in the secular age? And I'll say a little bit more about that as I move forward. But that's really the question that I'm posing in my book. And this is, I think, a question that is absolutely on the mind of contemporary artists, modern authors, right? It's, they're wanting to understand themselves the relationship between something called the sacred and something called the secular, and as it kind of expresses itself in a material attachment to the text. So there's just a couple of examples where I see again this question being posed. This is an example of an installation piece by the Israeli Moroccan artist Jacques Jeannot. It's called Say a Little and Do a Lot, and it's basically a kind of a repurposed book installation in Jerusalem. And so you see this stack of Sifrei Kodesh, right? This stack of holy books, of sacred texts that ordinarily in kind of normative Judaic tradition would be sort of accessioned, or would be put in what's called the Geniza, right? Which is a special repository used for religious texts or sacred texts when they've kind of lost their functionality or they've been damaged in some way, right? So they're put there, and it's kind of a special resting place, quote unquote, for them. And so Jeannot takes them and he makes an artwork out of them. And not only does he make an artwork out of them, and he doesn't really do anything very special, he just kind of piles them up in the gallery. And then he puts this kind of house on top, or this house-like structure, maybe even a kind of a tomb-like structure, right? Sort of suggesting there the resonance of the Geniza as a resting place, as a tomb, as a grave, as a graveyard for books. But here, again, in an art gallery in Jerusalem, we have to ask, is it ironic? Is he really interested in this sacredness? I think he is, as a sort of a person who comes from a sort of a semi-traditional background. I think he is interested in kind of rescuing, again, some sense of the sacredness of older texts in kind of an art gallery, which is, more of a kind of a secular space. So one more example before I get to some of the genres, some of the texts that I talk about in my book. This is another image, again, another kind of station, right? I've indicated that I'm interested in what authors and artists are thinking themselves about the centrality of textuality in traditional Jewish culture, and how a kind of a reverence for the text, a reverence for the material qualities of the text might shape modern cultural expression. And so this is a painting by Moses Sawyer, who's a Russian Jewish painter who came to the United States, came to New York as a young man. His brother Raphael was also a painter. They studied at the Artists League here in New York. And this is called The Lover of Books. And, I understand this painting as, a representation of the artist's attempt to think about his own sources of inspiration. What does it mean to be a Jewish painter, a Jewish visual artist in the early 20th century, working with a tradition that has normatively, notice how I said normatively, not entirely, but normatively been understood as a textual culture, as a culture that loves books, where, where can he find inspiration for himself as an artist? Now, notice how the figure at the center here, and I can come back to this image. You could put questions in the chat, but I can also return to this image when I'm done, because I think I could spend the next hour just talking about this image, but I'm not going to. But just notice a few things. First of all, the figure at the center, the lover of books, is an older figure. So I think that there's a suggestion here, and he seems attached to books, right? He's holding what could be a kind of some sort of a folio, maybe a Talmud, in his hand, and behind him on the bookshelf are also these kind of volumes that look like they could be sort of older texts, perhaps sacred texts, something connected to the rabbinic tradition of learning. And so as an older figure, without being too ageist, right, I think that the artist is suggesting here that that attachment is in the past. Notice how behind him on the shelf, we get a kind of a plethora. We get this kind of almost A to Z, rendering of art history, different visual artifacts or artifacts that signal or signify different periods in art history. It's kind of classical, almost Hellenistic kind of bust. Here, a photograph. In the back, something that looks like a photograph of a woman's body, maybe a dancer. Work in the background, which is a little more abstract. I don't know if you can see this here. David, you're going to have to tell me if you can see this, but you'll take my word for it that this is a pieta, right? In other words, that this is a figure of the Virgin Mary, of kind of a sacred female figure from Christianity. And here, a painting in a frame. Most of them actually seem to be connected to women's bodies, which is another kind of interesting question. But what I want to suggest is that in the background, on top of or in relationship to the textual tradition of Judaism, we have a kind of an alternative, if you will, set of aesthetic options. And notice that the figure himself, the lover of books, is almost himself kind of preserved as a sort of a bust set on top of the shelf. So if this is a painting about the artist's sources of inspiration and the kind of the productive ways in which a Jewish painter might use Jewish textuality, might kind of capitalize upon the centrality of textuality within Jewish tradition, and indeed build a kind of a vocabulary for producing modern Jewish art. It seems to me that it has to contain all of these things. I'll just throw in here, just for the sake of argument, right, something that maybe some of you are thinking about, which is this idea of that historically the second commandment, this kind of prohibition on certain forms of sculptural representation, particularly the divine and the human body, that was somehow an impediment for Jewish artists. And certainly in some traditional settings, we can say for sure, maybe, that we have some evidence of that. But I actually think that kind of prohibition, or that taboo, let's call it, on certain forms of visual representation, I think that was actually quite stimulating for many Jewish artists. And they often found themselves working in relationship to that ostensible prohibition and producing very, very interesting art. This is, I think, one example there. One last thing, notice that he's not wearing a head covering. This is, fascinating to me. In other words, is this individual, is he observant in some way? Is he not observant? We can talk about this. I think, again, this painting offers a lot of food for thought around this question of, again, the role of textuality, the centrality of the materiality of the book in modern Jewish expression. Okay.
Barbara, before you go on, someone asked, and the question would be old if we went beyond it. How do you know the lover of books is a Jewish man? I mean, yes, the painter is Jewish, but is there anything about the man that says Jewish?
I think it's for me, it's the context of the painting, and thinking about Sawyer's work and this kind of connection to interwar Jewish and Yiddish culture in New York, that, he has to be thinking on some level about this great divide between text and image within Western culture. Now, it's true, text and image, ou pictura poesis, right? This goes back to ancient culture, this kind of tension between the picture and the poem, or between spatial representation and temporal representation. It's not just a Jewish thing, but I think that when we think about Sawyer's work in that interwar period, in relation to people like Marc Chagall, even in relation later to somebody like a Rothko, that there is a kind of a sensitivity, I would say, an awareness. It's different than Picasso. It's different than Picasso also was interested in text and image, but there's no violins here, right? He's also interested in that kind of multi-representational domain. So I don't think it has to be, well, I'm going to go out on a limb. I think it has to be a Jewish lover of books. We can argue after. Is that okay, David?
That's great. No, I don't think there's an argument. It's just that someone was curious.
Yeah, I mean, again, for me, it has to do with how the visual, it's how the painting is coded.
Yeah, no, it makes total sense. Go ahead.
Okay, but there's so many things to say. I'm going to move on. Okay. Again, so I'm just going to reiterate what happens to this kind of attention to textuality, or an attention to the materiality of the text, the sacredness of the text, when we enter Jewish modernity, and there's this kind of general, not absolute, but this kind of general movement away from traditional religious forms towards something that we might call the secular. Where does this kind of devotion to the book as an object, or the text as a material, sacred construct, where does it go? How is it expressed? And can we find residual traces of it, right, in something that we might call secular genres? So what I mean by secular genres are things like the novel, the lyric poem. My book is really organized around these kind of modern secular genres. Each chapter is devoted to kind of locating the material forms, these residual traces of the material in different genres, right, in relation to the formal qualities of the particular genre. And I can come back and talk about Call It Sleep, this marvelous idea of the book as an object within Jewish modernism. This is the first edition of Call It Sleep. Most of us, if you know this book, you probably encountered it as a kind of a crappy little paperback at some point, even in the 60s when it was reissued. But in its first iteration, it got the full-on treatment. It was really a kind of a magnificent, magnificent object. So one place where we see, or one genre, right? And by genre, I mean a lot of things, but genre means kind of category of literature, or kind of a grouping, a corpus of works that are united around a certain structural or formal similarity. So one place where we see a kind of a really, I want to call it a kind of an exuberant attention to this question of the relation between text and image, or the degree to which a book can also be a beautiful object, or just an interesting material object, just an object that you want to hold, or that you want to look at and marvel over, is in this interwar genre of the little magazine. And this is a kind of a global phenomenon, right? Little magazines are published by artists all over the world in all different languages. They're published in metropolitan centers, and they're published in more provincial towns. The Jewish ones, for the most part, are produced collaboratively in these kind of cosmopolitan settings that we find in urban centers like Berlin, like Kyiv, like Lvov, like Warsaw, Paris, where there's a kind of there's kind of a critical mass of a Jewish emigre population of producers as well as readers, right? So these are the example here that I'm showing you is actually, it's sui generis. It's kind of a really unique example. It's a magazine that was published in the same issue in Hebrew and Yiddish together, Milgroim Rimon, which means pomegranate. So most of these, even though in many of these journals we can see, and I use the term journal and little magazine kind of interchangeably, we can see a play with different kinds of languages. This is the only one where where we find a fully bilingual edition. And so they're produced by a kind of a cohort. They're collaboratively produced. There's a kind of an editorial board of writers and artists. They're often deliberately provocative. But they're also, I want to say, the whole question of the secular here is really kind of interesting, because they are a magazine, a journal that's meant to circulate, like the New Yorker today, right? In other words, that's how they understood themselves, as kind of cultural, political, social, topical, fine arts, snobby, a little elitist. Sorry, I read the New Yorker. But they're also really kind of connected, I think, in interesting ways. And here's where this passage from the religious, or the sort of more traditional forms of expression, to the secular is really kind of crucial, because you see in this example, for example, of Pomegranate, of Ramon Milgrom, the title here references a kind of a really privileged symbol. I was going to say a privileged fruit, but I think it's really, a symbol within Judaic culture of artistry and of royalty, right? Sort of, going back to the priestly robes in the Bible, and and for centuries is kind of a symbol connected with Jewish art. And so even though, again, they understand themselves to be this kind of erudite journal of the moment, they're also interested in drawing on, or motivating, if you will, some sort of connection to tradition, to sacred tradition. And I'm going to show just a few examples here, right? So another way in which I think that these journals were connected, in other words, they are secular through and through, but their connection to religious forms, right, to traditional religious forms, often provocatively, is through the use of the alphabet as an icon, right, the alphabet as an image. And so Chagall really kind of excelled at this, reveled in this. So the two images here on the left, here, Haliastra, the same journal that was published in Warsaw in 1921, also appears again, a different issue, in Paris in 1924. And you see the title here, Haliastra, and a little mini Chagall, or maybe that's a mini Chagall. I think down here is the little mini Chagall, and he's holding up a sign that says Paris. Here he is, Strom, or current. Haliastra means our gang. Strom means current or trend, or force, kind of a torrent. There's lots of ways to think about it, a stream, yeah. And there too, the letters are, meant to be kind of legible as Hebrew letters, but also pictures, right? And so here, you see a little bit, and I'll describe this final example. This is Albatross, published in Berlin in 1923. And you can see here a little bit of the German language on the cover, but the journal itself is fully in Yiddish. And again, this kind of play with text and image is part and parcel of modernism writ large, right? I'm not saying that this is an exclusively Jewish practice, but potentially a little more scandalous for these Jewish artists to take these letters associated with sacred texts and turn them into pictures. One last example from the little magazines, and here we are back. This is the cover of Egan's, which I referred to earlier on the cover of my book. And I want to just sort of describe to you what it is that you're seeing here on this cover. On the far right, I'm having trouble seeing my screen, I apologize. On the far right is a painting from a synagogue from, we think from the late 18th century, 1780s, the Mohilov synagogue. This was in Ukraine. And the artist who created this cover, his name was Rybak, he visited these synagogues in the early part of the 20th century, 1910 or so, and then created this drawing. And then at some point that kind of morphed into the cover of this magazine. And so you see here again, the way in which a traditional synagogue motif becomes kind of repurposed for the cover of this of this avant-garde magazine. I'm happy to come back to any of these images later. I know it's kind of a lot to absorb, but again, the sort of the general principle here is to think about ways in which these artists and these writers are kind of motivating or using traditional Jewish symbols in these new avant-garde settings. Okay, so now we have a little bit of a pivot. I mentioned earlier that my book is organized by genre. So each chapter takes a kind of a different cohort, a kind of a sampling. There's one chapter about poetry, another chapter about novels. I've just talked a little bit about the little magazines, but the spine or the pivot of the book is this middle chapter. This is a chapter on Yizkor books, on memorial books. And this is not, I have to say that these are, I'll describe a little bit what they are, but it's kind of an atypical use for memorial books, right? So Yizkor books is a genre that emerged after the Second World War. And there's somewhere between 900 and 1,500 of them out there, each of them named for a different town that was destroyed during the war. And sort of depending upon how you calculate them. The New York Public Library has one system of categorizing them, JTS, YIVO, different. And here I really do need to make a direct shout out and a thank you to David, because these were books that that David let me kind of take home from the library when the library was in a period of great transition. And through COVID, I had them. And they were really important. It was really important for me to have these books with me physically while I was writing this chapter. And so each one is devoted to a particular town. And they're produced, like the little magazines, collaboratively, typically by a group of survivors in a kind of a post-war setting, with an eye to telling the story, the history of their town, as well as its end, its destruction, to their children, to other survivors, and to their families. So typically these books have been used by historians in kind of very interesting, and sometimes, historians, they're not so, they find them sometimes a little unreliable. They're just people's memories. They're just things that people gathered. And so there's a lot of sort of conversation about what exactly these books are. I am interested in them as objects. And one of the reasons that I'm interested in them as objects is because that is how the authors of these books understood them. They conceived of them as memorial objects. And they compare them in the introductions to these books. They compare them to memorial candles, to tombstones, right? So the iconography, when I looked at these books, I was interested in a kind of what we might call a kind of a shared iconography. And also the ways in which these books reference themselves as objects, as material objects of memory. And again, the people who put these books together seem to me were interested in creating this kind of post-war genre, a secular genre, that would somehow serve as a memorial object for the towns that were lost. And they're huge, these books, I want to say. The sort of the physical, the first thing to notice really is their size, right? These are big, big books. And that's one of the reasons it was important for me to be able to see them in the library. If you go now, if you're interested, you can go, the New York Public Library especially has a wonderful collection, but what you access most immediately are these kind of scanned and bound versions of them. So there's this sort of homogeneous set that you encounter, and you lose a little bit of the uniqueness of each of them, right? So the longest that I've seen, the one that has the most pages, is about 1,000 pages, but it's not unusual, for them to top 500 or 600 pages. And I was interested again in kind of locating a shared iconography, right? The tombstones and the candles, different kinds of lists, different kinds of memorial, different kinds of testimonies. Some of them have photographs and candelabras, fallen candelabras, a lot of fire, a lot of flames. And one particular feature really kind of grabbed me. Each of them has a map. a kind of a memory map, if you will, right? Again, important sites in the town, typically hand drawn. Some of them have a little bit more. They look like, they're sort of a little more like by a professional cartographer, but for the most part, they're hand drawn by a survivor who marked the sort of important places in the town. Some of them are sort of central public places like markets or sites of religious observance, different street names. Some of them get kind of embellished in different ways, which sort of signify in a more affective or more emotional way. So this is, you notice here, the borders here, the roads, either railroad tracks and or barbed wire, right? Kind of a more this is Vausha, right? Sort of a more generalized version. This is Belchentov, the shtetl, and showing its relationship to Vausha. So there's a lot of different forms that they take, and these are they're incredibly personal, right? So in this example, we see this thick line here marking the ghetto, the central market square. This is the ghetto brick, and up here on the right is a group of trees that's been labeled Jentaswald. So the drawer of this map, the preparer of this map, thought it was important to indicate the forest where the gossips hung out, where people shared gossips, right? That was what it was known as colloquially. So, again, we sort of see these maps as, conveying a sense of the history of the town, but from a very personal point of view. And typically, I want to say, maps are often instruments of power. I think of these maps as maps of resistance, right? And so in this example, we see the rare notation of the map maker's name, Michael Forman, and in the legend, we can find not only the place where he and other partisans stored their weapons, but even the home of his parents, right? And so that there's this sense in which the sort of personal history and personal history, personal memory, and the history of the town itself kind of merge in these very special maps. I'm happy again to come back to any of these, just checking the time. Okay, so the memorial books, this chapter on the Iskra books, again, form the kind of the spine of my book. They're this unusual genre, right? Are they history? Are they testimony? They have all these kinds of illustrations. There's photographs, there's maps, there's lists, there's drawings. They're this very kind of hybrid mixed genre. And again, what I'm interested in is sort of lifting up or drawing attention to their material features in relation to the material features of the other genres that I talk about. And so the last third of the book is devoted to two very distinct genres of what we might call the sort of the postmodern period. The first is the graphic novel or long form comics, and the second is the artist book. So I'm just going to say just a little bit about both of these concluding genres, and then I'll open the floor for some discussion. So the graphic novel, or what we might think of as long form comics narratives, this is a genre where Jewish writers and themes connected to Jewish history, Jewish culture have predominated in really interesting ways. So beginning with Art Spiegelman's Mouse in the 1980s, and up into our own day. It's a sort of a really vibrant, robust cohort of creators and themes, again, in a kind of a global setting. Spiegelman famously kind of hated the term graphic novel. He thought it was too highbrow, right? He did not, I think I have here, didn't set out to write, he says, a graphic novel about the Holocaust per se, but he wanted to produce a long form comics where readers would need a bookmark. So he's interested in the book as an object, as a kind of an immersive object. And for any of you who have read Mouse, I'm sure you'll agree, it's a very demanding read, but the play of image and text throughout creates a very immersive experience. A few more examples here. Le Chat de Rabbin, The Rabbi's Cat. This is a wonderful series by the French artist Johann Sfar, in which a cat kills a parrot, swallows a parrot, and learns how to talk. And we get here, sort of a kind of a very interesting and idiosyncratic discussion of Jewish theology and the relationship between animals and humans. All the binaries are overthrown, but also a really fascinating cultural history of Algiers in the interwar period. One more example from the great Israeli artist Rutu Modan. This is a book called The Property, which came out in 2012. Originally appears in Hebrew, but it's been published in a dozen different languages, and takes place in the city of Warsaw. And again, just kind of drawing your attention here to the creative ways in which text and image are used on the page to create a sense of depth and also a sense of history. Untersachen takes place in New York. And this work by Lila Corman is really a kind of an intervention in traditional American Jewish narratives about acculturation. She follows a set of twin sisters whose education happens really on the streets and in the brothels of New York City. So again, another way in which in this text especially, we find the author kind of appropriating classic scenes like Hester Street, but giving us a very new rendering of them. And finally, my last example, my last genre, and this is the genre of artist books. And, this is a kind of a sort of a loose category, I would say, but it can range from books that are in very limited editions, books that are almost objects of art, just kind of one-offs, singular objects collected in museums and in archives, but also something called a democratic multiple. It could be something like a zine, something that is produced in multiple editions and in multiple copies and distributed really widely. In my own kind of way of thinking about this genre, I think about this is the genre where the book is the topic, right? Anything that an artist book is, any kind of book that interrogates the notion of the book, about what it means to be a book on a material level. And so you'll see artist books kind of playing with what we might think of as some of the normative features of the book, such as the codex. I want to maybe mention here that this is an artist book by Lynn Avadenka, who currently has a marvelous exhibit up at JTS about Jewish women printers in the 16th and 17th century. So just, to sort of say that this kind of way of trying to investigate and think about print culture, material culture in Jewish history goes way back. This is her story of Esther and Scheherazade, and you can see here again how the form of her book kind of mimics this kind of circular pattern, the conversation, her imagined conversation between these two women who never actually met, but she kind of imagines a conversation with them, and the form of the book takes this kind of circular patterning, playing against sort of the typical notion of the codex or a book having a beginning, a middle, and an end. Just a few more examples from the Jerusalem print workshop, a book in a matchbox, a book that opens like an accordion, and a book that lives in a wooden box. Andy Arnovitz, marvelous, collection of work that investigates landscape through the lens of 3 different languages, and plays here with Arabic and Hebrew and English to think about this notion of the border or of a fence. A gadel chai is the Hebrew expression here, and that simply means shrubs. But she kind of expands this metaphor to think about the space of Jerusalem and the ways in which it's divided. And finally, this is an artist book that I created as part of a workshop in Salt Lake City several years ago. And I was interested in kind of trying to see, how this question of materiality and the sacred as I'd seen it sort of playing out or explored it in different genres within Jewish writing. I wanted to see if I could create something that would be kind of my own contribution, my own rendering of this question. And so inside, it's a box, and it has the word Dvarim, which of course is the title of the biblical book of Deuteronomy, but also means things and words. So we get things and words together. And I created a box that looks like one of those folios, right, that the lover of books was holding under his arm. But then it opens, and inside I have other things. Books are things that hold things. This is Adrian Piper, kind of a more contemporary take on book theory and book culture. And in my container, right, in my container of the book, I include covers of little magazines. This is Schriften, Yiddish magazine, was published in New York. Some samples from Max Weber, who was a contemporary of Sawyer, and also part of this sort of interwar coterie of artists and Yiddish writers and artists who were interested in this kind of modern secular idiom. A passage, a copy of one of Weber's articles from the Smithsonian, and a little scroll here to kind of indicate, again, the sacredness at the heart of it all. And I think that is my last slide. Wow, how'd I do? Excellent. We have time for questions.
We do have time for questions, and that was great. Thank you so much. Let me just do that. And people, whoever has a comment or a question, please throw it into the chat, and we will share it with the author. One person observed, and I since I heard your presentation of the Grolier Club, I heard the same question asked.
Yeah, I tried to mix it up a little bit. I didn't do the exact same thing.
No, you didn't. But you know, since it's on the cover of your book, and you comment on those images as foxes, and the question was raised, well, they look like different animals to me. So someone asked that tonight as well.
So I think, you know, what's interesting to me, and so first of all, absolutely, like, I'm not really sure. I call them foxes. I'm not really sure what they are. They look to me like foxes. I can put the image up again if you want. But
it's okay. We don't have to. I mean, there's no debate. It's just.
But the thing is that what I really wanted to show was how there's this fabulous kind of visual culture that was preserved in synagogues, particularly in the Ukraine, but in other locations in Eastern and Central Europe, where ceilings were decorated with the zodiac and with animals. And Jewish artists, Ansky, the great ethnographer, would, you know, this was part of his kind of his task in sort of preserving what they understood, right? I mean, this is prior to this 1910, 1911, and they thought, oh my God, the shtetl is over. You know, they understood that there was a big sea change in Jewish life. And so they set out to sort of record traditional forms of Jewish life. And one part of that was sending artists to draw, to take photographs, and to also draw from these images of animals and the natural world that were part of this visual culture in synagogues. And then somehow those drawings made it into these Yiddish magazines. So that's but they go through this sort of the Play-Doh, right? That's, I think, the image that I came up with, right? It's like they're sort of put through the little Play-Doh machine, the Art Nouveau, Art Deco machine, and they come out as this kind of avant-garde patterning, almost like wallpaper. Like, if I could get wallpaper like that, I definitely would.
Probably could. So, you know, I mean, with this very important emphasis on the fact that a book is not merely the text recorded therein, but a lot more. What do we do with the fact that, at least for some people, there's a move against books as physical object and reduction merely to text? I'm not sure how to interpret the look on your face. I think I see
Yeah,
a little bit
I
of
don't
lament
know.
there, but go
But
ahead.
I need more context for the question.
Well, I mean, the questioner is asking actually about, I mean, I'm curious just about the shift in phenomenon, right? In other words, when a book is no longer an object in the same way, meaning a persistent object, but merely electronic, bits that
Like a
show up on screen.
Kindle. Yeah.
But then if the people of the book, right, if the meaning of the book there is also book as object, that what happens to the people in the absence of the physical book?
Well, they change. I mean, the people are still there, right? The people don't disappear. We know that, I don't have a Kindle, but I read on my phone all the time. I'm not anti-progress, and I don't disavow the utility. And even, as a teacher also, I see this all the time. My students are like, always, they're reading on their iPads and they're reading, and I just think, oh my God, don't you have a headache from that? But they don't. But they also like books. So I don't think the book is over in any way. I think the book as a form, and by book I mean like the codex, like the book where you open it stuff and then you close it. I think that is probably one of the most durable inventions ever. And it's not going anywhere. And it's people, I mean, it's for sure. I don't think it will ever be replaced. I think that there are other iterations of it, and we can use them in different ways. But the book qua book, I don't think, I'm not the only one who says this, by the way, right? I mean, the book qua book as an object is not going anywhere. It's just really convenient. And people like to hold things, and they like to have things and give things, and, and have them in their house behind them. Whatever. There's like all of that objecthood. I think that we're still very, very much attached to that.
Good. I couldn't agree more. So this next question, I'm not even going to venture to paraphrase. I'm just going to read it because I think it's carefully formulated. Can you summarize some of the residual material from the sacred in the modern Jewish texts? You describe the alphabet in detail. Can you name or rename others?
So it's a really great question. I think that, the way that I've explored it in the book is in different genres. Like, in other words, I try to identify a kind of a material feature, a formal feature, and think about it in material terms. And so one genre that I haven't really talked about tonight, just because it's hard sometimes in a webinar setting to really address it, is poetry. And, and so poems that have a kind of a pictorial focus, either thematically or in language that has kind of syntax or vocabulary that calls attention to itself. Imagery where the line gets kind of jammed up, the use of words of color, or even the use of alliterative patterning that calls your attention to, the reader's attention to the poem as a made object. Mm-hmm. What they call, Ezra Pound called imagism, right? Poems like sculptures. And in almost every version, in almost every iteration of modernism, French, Russian, German, English, whatever, there's this interest, right, in how can language be like paint, pictorial. So that would be like another way in which the sacred, that for me is a kind of a residual trace of the sacred, because also when you have poetry that's written in Hebrew script, right, either Hebrew or Yiddish, it's like odioter, it's like even more potentially taboo, right? Because then you have a poem, not only a poem that behaves like an object, but a poem that's potentially an idol, because it's in this script, this alphabet that has a kind of a charge, a sort of a sacred charge. So that would be just one other example. I mean, there are more. I think in the Yizkor books, there's a lot of evidence for, that sort of motivating the iconography of the sacred in ways that are connected to other forms of Jewish textual memory, like the Pinkas, or the, sort of these pre-modern forms. But it seems to me that the Yizkor book is it's a fascinating genre because of its plenitude, because of how many of them there are, and because of, its status as an object that replaces the town itself.
Got it. Wonderful. Very, very rich. I have to say, speaking not only for myself, I'm quite sure that this is just enriching every way of thinking about books. Wonderful. And Barbara, you're on your way to another institution to teach. So on behalf of the JTS Library and myself, I want to say we're going to miss you. But, next time, the next book that you publish, think of us, because we'd love to. Okay, great. We'd love to welcome you back. People know where to buy their books these days, but I always ask the authors if they have if you have a preference for where people buy your book.
No, I don't. I mean, if you have a local bookstore, an independent bookseller, I would say, go there. Otherwise, I'm agnostic.
Okay, that's great. Well, thank you everybody for coming.
Thank you everyone for coming. Appreciated it very much.
Yeah, and I just want to observe that we've got another great book talk coming up next Tuesday, actually, by a former colleague of ours at JTS, Judith Houtman, who will be talking about her most recent publication. So if you haven't signed up for that, please do, and for future programs besides. So I wish everybody a good night.
Thank you so much.
And we hope we'll see you again soon.
Thank you.
Sure.